Welcome to the first video in the series about uibuilder. uibuilder is a tool for creating web interfaces, web UIs from Node-red, the low-code development environment. And let's get started. So the first thing you need to do is add uibuilder to the palette in Node-red. So I'm assuming that you already know a little bit about Node-red. If not, please go and do some research on that first and then come back to this video. So we'll look for uibuilder in the palette manager. There it is. I've already got it installed. If you haven't, click on the install button, and after a few seconds it will be installed, and it will appear in the palette here at the side. So in order to get started with uibuilder, very simple, drag the main node onto your flow. That's the start. We probably want some simple inputs and outputs, so we'll just add those and wire them up, and a debug for the top output. I'll explain what these all do in a second. Just adjust the settings on that so that we get everything out of there and we get a count out of that, and we'll just make it smaller. Now I can copy and paste that and then wire that one up to the bottom. Now one final thing left to do is double click on this and give ourselves a URL. You'll notice the red triangle. That means that there's something wrong with the configuration of this node, and that is that we must enter a valid URL. Now the URL in this case is just a segment of the actual URL that will be used when you point your browser at the output. So choose something short but relatively descriptive. I'm just going to say that this one is going to be called test, and you'll notice that it's telling you that the URL doesn't yet exist because you need to do a deployment first. If you try and put something in here that already exists, that you've already deployed, it will warn you about that as well. So I'm going to put test YT for YouTube, and that's it. You'll notice there's not a lot else I can do at the moment. I can give it a name and a topic, but it doesn't really help very much. I can't do any of these other things yet, and that's because I need to deploy it. So click on done. The red triangle's gone away. Click on deploy, and that is it. You now have a working web interface. So reopen this. You can use one of the open buttons, which will change tabs, and there you have your user interface all nicely set up and ready for you to use. And you'll note that you've not had to do any coding. We're just making use of the default template, and that template has some basic features built in, which we will have a quick look at. So just so that you can see, I'm going to put these windows side by side so that we get the ability to see both of them at the same time. Grab the right thing. Let's close that. I need that. Move that over a little. And we'll have a look at the debug output. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that we already have some outputs that have come out of this second port, this lower port. Now this, if you hover over here, tells you what it is. It's control messages from uibuilder. So uibuilder sends control messages out into the flow when certain things happen. And the first one that you'll see is this one called Client Connect. That was fired off as soon as we opened this web page. If I were to close it, I would also get a disconnect, client disconnect message. And then the other interesting one is visibility. So visibility changes as the visibility of the page changes. in anybody's browser. So multiple people could have this open. You would get visibility messages from each one of them. So if I minimize this for a second, you'll see I got another visibility message. This time is visible is false because it's no longer visible. And if I make it visible again, I'll get another message, is visible is now true. And you'll see that all of these control messages have quite a lot of information in them about the client connection. So first of all, it's telling me this control message is coming from the client. Some of the control messages come from the server. Socket ID is to do with the communications channel between the browser and the Node-RED server. What version of the client's being used, what's the IP address of the client, a unique client identifier. We'll talk about more about that in a future session. Similarly, a tab identifier that identifies the browser tab. The URL that was in use. Now, the reason for the URL and page name is that uibuilder supports having multiple pages within a single node, and they can even be in different folders. So this can change quite a bit. Here you can see that I have no name here, no .html file here, but it is here. And that's just the way that most web servers work. You have a default page which doesn't need to show itself up here, and very typically it's called index.html, and that's the convention that uibuilder uses. The next number we'll come back to in the future. We don't need to worry about too much at the moment. The last navigation type tells us what the user did last. So, for example, we could change between pages here and then go back again, and this will tell you what the user last did. TLS is about security of the web pages. Currently, TLS is off on this demo system. When did the client connect? So that tells us that kind of thing is really useful for doing bespoke security. So you can work out, should that client still be connected, or do you need to make them revalidate? The referrer is quite simply will change depending on what you've clicked and what pages you navigated between. There's no topic on this. Topic of message ID, those are standard Node-RED bits of information. So you'll see that repeated through all of these control messages have a very similar set of data. Sometimes they may have one or two other bits of information as well, but a lot of it is very standard. And you can use the client connect and disconnect messages in particular and actually loop those back. And in another video, we'll look at how do we cache information that's been sent to your front end in a way that enables new client connections or reloaded pages to get the last set of data or a set of data that is consistent for completely rebuilding the page to the current state. Don't worry about that for now, we'll come back to that. So that's the basics, very, very simple. And what we'll do next is try sending some messages backwards and forwards. So the first thing we'll do is send a message from Node-RED, from the server, through to the browser client. And we do that with this simple inject, press the button, and immediately you see you get a message appear over here. And that's what uibuilder is all about, that data-driven user web interface. But similarly, we can send messages back the other way. And we've got two buttons here that demonstrate two different ways of doing this. I'll show you this one first. It's called event send, which is the simpler one of the two. It's easier to use. And you'll notice as soon as I press it, you get information over here. Some of this stuff is pretty standard for Node-RED. But then the payload, you'll see. Now, I'll explain where this data comes from very shortly. And basically you can just put some simple tags into your front-end HTML to generate that data, or you can generate it dynamically. And then we have this _UI object, and you'll notice that some of this information is very similar to the control messages, but there's a whole bunch of other information as well. So first of all, it's telling us what type of thing has been sent back. The slot text is the text that appears inside the button in this particular case. Slot being a standard way of describing the text that goes into your HTML tags. I'll come back to these in a second. The event that triggered this message to come back was a click event. So in the front end, I used the mouse to click on here. That's the event that was triggered. You can also see that I can trigger events with some control keys pressed down. So if I hold down, let's see, the control key and click on this button, so I've sent another message, and now you'll see in _UI that control key is set to true instead of false. What type of pointer caused this event to happen? Well, it was the mouse. And what type of HTML tag was the trigger? In this case, it's a button tag. Don't need to worry too much about that at the moment. So in addition, we have a couple of other things here. So attributes, or attributes, this takes the attributes that are on the button tag in this case in the HTML. We'll look at the HTML in a minute. And you can see that there are 3 attributes on that. One is called onClick, and that is actually what does the event send. And you can see that as a standard piece of code. You can copy and paste that to any other button in any UI builder front end, and that will always work. But there are 2 other attributes, and this is where we get the payload from. So data-something attributes are a standard in HTML for adding data to a tag. And as you can see, we've just put a couple of examples in there, one called event send and one called bar. And when we look at the payload, we get type of event send because it was type, and foo is set to the content bar, the value bar. Yep, so that's where they've come from. So that's a very easy way of sending a little bit of data back into Node-RED from your front end, and particularly useful if you've got a bit of standard data. Props, there are no props on this particular one. Properties that you can add dynamically using JavaScript in the front end to add some additional data, more complex data if you need it, onto the properties of that tag, that element, and they will be sent back to Node-RED as well. So that's how we can very simply send data back without really having to write any code, certainly no more than a single line. So that's that one. Now the other button uses a more traditional way of sending data back. It uses a function called send, which is virtually identical to the send function that you would use in Node-RED itself for sending out a message. Yeah, and these messages, you'll note, I should have said that, come out of that top port, yeah, which is the standard message port. And if you hover over there, it tells you what it's for. So here we get more control about what we put into the message, and as you can see, there's nowhere near as much information here. It's just a very basic, simple set of data. Now we can change that somewhat. So if I come into and edit the settings, if I go to advanced, one of the things that I can do, which you may wish to do, particularly if you're doing your own security processing, is turn that flag on, and we'll see what that does. Click that, deploy it. You can see that we had a client disconnect because the communications connection between the front end and the back end was interrupted, and then it automatically reconnected again. So we had those two messages. Let me just clear that. I'm going to press this button again. Let's see what the difference is. So the difference is that this time we have this underscore UIB object added to the output message. You see it's still a standard message, but this time we've included some of that message, some of that data that we saw before around the details of what the client is, what the client has done, how it's connected, where it's connected from. So all things that might be useful if you're making decisions around how the front end and the back end need to communicate with each other, and decisions around, is this client actually a valid client for me to allow it to communicate with me. And one last thing, a very quick look at the actual code that's behind this. Now, as I said, we've written no code whatsoever. uibuilder has a built-in file editor, because don't forget, these files are on the Node-RED server. They're not on your local PC. So this is all standard stuff. This is just getting everything set up. You can see that we're loading the uibuilder library here, the front-end library, and then we're loading a file that contains our own custom code. And of course, you can change bits, and you can change icons and styling information. So here is what actually defines the front end itself, and you can see that it's very, very simple. This is something that is completely standard and is included in all of the templates. It just allows you to see what messages have been sent from Node-RED into the front end. Here are our two buttons, and as you can see, very, very simple. So one calls a JavaScript function, which we'll look at in a second, and passes it a text message. The other one directly calls a function that exists within the uibuilder front-end library. So you don't have to code any of that. You don't have to change any of this. It's all standard. And here are our data attributes that we can add, and you can add whatever you like to that. So quick look at the JavaScript. Again, most of this is just commenting. We have a little function that you'll notice does another front-end library call, this time send. So if you've ever used the send function in a function node in Node-RED, you'll be familiar with this. It's exactly the same format. Nothing special there. And then finally, we have another function here called onChange. onChange is a standard way of listening to events within that are happening within the library. In this case, we're saying if the uibuilder message variable changes, then we want to run this function. That variable will be changed every time Node-RED sends a message to the uibuilder node. That happens automatically within the library. So all you need to do is add this listener function, and then you can do whatever you like when that message comes in. In this case, all we're doing is getting a reference to it, and then, a reference to the item on screen. Let's see there where that is. There to go. ID equals message. So the pound symbol or hash symbol followed by the HTML ID. That is a selector. It's called a CSS selector. And the dollar function is added by the uibuilder library as a helper function. So basically, you can put in any CSS selector in there, and they can get quite complex, but they are very, very logical. So this will give you a reference to that piece of visual furniture, if you like, on screen. into that variable, and then we just make sure that we actually found it in case you've deleted it from the front end code. Assuming you did find it, then we set its inner HTML to the content of the message that's been passed through this standard function called syntax highlight, which basically we saw before. And quick look again, just add some coloring to the output as you see it on screen. So all we're doing is this produces some HTML, and we're passing that HTML into the inner section of the tag on screen, which is basically what starts off as being this is replaced by the highlighted version of the message, and that's it. Again, completely standard. Leave that in, take it out, doesn't matter. Everything still works. One other thing to look at in the HTML very, very quickly, all of the templates now have this line in here, and it's a very simple dummy line that we use as a target in quite a lot of examples. So again, you don't need to keep this, but you might find it useful if you're following along in some of the other examples and tutorials. And that's it. The rest of that is up to you. Now, in one of the next videos, I'll show you how to make dramatic changes to your visual layout without writing any code. So a zero code approach to creating things on screen. But I'll wait for the next video. That is the basics of uibuilder. We'll cover these other tabs in more detail at another point. Oh, one more thing to show very, very quickly. The CSS file contains the styling information, and in this particular case, all we're doing is loading the styling from a uibuilder standard file called UIB brand. There is a different styling one there if you prefer to use that one. These are probably not complete. They won't do everything that you want them to do, but the brand one in particular is responsive to the way you have your browser set up. So if your browser is set up as a light interface, all of this will be much brighter. And if you have it set to dark, as mine is at the moment, you'll have this darker interface. Up to you how you make use of that. And obviously you don't need to make use of it. You can replace it with your own stuff as well. And again, we'll have a look at that in some future video. Okay, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed that, and we'll catch you in the next video.